very special show today, and we're sitting here with a very special lady who's meant a lot to the game of baseball. She's the only female to ever coach a Major League Baseball game for the Los Angeles Dodgers.
Manage, actually.
Manage. She got thrown out of the game once we heard the story. Anyway.
You can see my argumentative side.
Yeah, I know. Very argumentative. But anyway, getting to the beginning. I want to talk a little bit about when you fell in love with baseball as a child.
Well, baseball was sort of like background music in our home. My father and uncle and grandfather were big Yankee fans, and I remember our summer house in Montauk, there was a little black and white TV, and it was always running, and I would hear the names Mantle and Maris and Whitey Ford, but it didn't really come to life for me until my Uncle Bob brought me to Shea Stadium for my first Major League Baseball game with my cousin Randy, who's like a sister. And it was like Dorothy landing in Oz, where that little black and white TV suddenly turned color, and I remember that sparkling emerald green field, and then the players becoming personalities to me. And the first personality who really grabbed me was Tug McGraw, who was a southpaw pitcher just starting out at the time, and he was the first Met to defeat Sandy Koufax. Now, in a New York Jewish home, Sandy Koufax was Godhead, because at a time when it was really difficult to do this, he refused to pitch in the World Series on Yom Kippur and stood up for who he was. So we all loved Sandy Koufax. And then when Tug defeated him, it was an emotional moment. I saw him on the post-game show afterward, and he was so funny and had this infectious energy and this intelligence, and he just immediately won my heart. He got cut from the team later that year and sent to the minors, and I started writing him letters of encouragement, and he would write back. And he'd send me pictures and news about things, and I told him, when you make the team, and you will, you'll come to our house for dinner. My parents, of course, didn't know this. So one spring, the phone rings, and my father says, "Jill, it's Tug McGraw of the New York Mets for you." And I said, "Oh," and he came over for dinner.
You were expecting his phone call, so that was perfect.
I was expecting it. Nobody else was, but he did join us for dinner, and at that time I started a fan club for him, and we began a lifelong friendship.
But you probably were the first female to start a fan club for a baseball player.
No, there have always been women who love the sport. I belonged to the Sandy Koufax fan club, which was run by a woman.
Oh, wow, wonderful.
And the Jerry Grody fan club, that was run by a 16-year-old girl. And I belonged to a couple of other fan clubs too, but those were all run by boys.
But Tug didn't have one, so you needed to start one.
Tug didn't have one, and he needed someone to believe in him so he could get everybody else to believe. So.
And you did just that.
It was a great experience.
And that relationship developed over time?
We were lifelong friends. We became lifelong friends until his death.
Now, that's wonderful. So, fast forward, you moved to Los Angeles.
Yes.
And you started working for a show.
Well, what happened, my first show was, after I graduated from Cornell, I worked on a show in New York as an assistant. It was the only real show in New York. And it was by Jim Bouton, whose book Ball 4 was being brought to life as a sitcom. And I had an assistant job, but I would pitch stories to Jim whenever I could grab his ear. And he got me a writer's meeting, and then he told me the day after, "We'd love to hear your stories." That's the good news. The bad news is we just got canceled. Oh. So I knew I needed to move to LA if I wanted to be a TV writer. But when I first came out here, I was working on a game show, and it was a very sexist environment. There were things that are now illegal going on there, but it was a hard place to be a girl. And the producer who originally hired me wouldn't let me attend the writers' meetings because he wanted me to sit at the front desk and be decorative. So
and she was quite pretty, so I understand why he would have done that. But needless to say, that still wasn't the right thing.
It wasn't the right thing. So at the height of my frustration, Tommy LaSorda and Steve Garvey were going to be guests on one of the shows. And I went to the dinner, and I got involved in a conversation with Steve Garvey and Tommy about the prior year's season. And we started arguing baseball, and that was how my career began in baseball.
Arguing baseball, I love it. So how did that end up occurring for you to manage the team?
First I was talking with Garvey, and he was very amused by me. I don't know how seriously he took me, but he was amused. And he said, "Tommy, you got to listen to what she said about the pitch out and this game against Philadelphia." And so I started talking to Tommy, and he was laughing and enjoying me. And then he said, "How come a little girl like you knows so much about baseball?" And my knees were trembling when I said this, but I had this wild hair idea all of a sudden. I said, I'm after your job. What do you think? And he laughed and he said, well, you're just a little girl. The players aren't going to listen to you. They're going to respect you. You've never played. And I said, well, that's all true. But I knew the Dodgers needed some good publicity. They'd been getting some bad publicity at that time for not getting their uniforms dirty and, being the Hollywood Dodgers. And I said, if you let me manage the team for one game, I said, it doesn't even have to count. It could be spring training. I'll fly there at my own expense as a girl with no money. And I'll learn and I'll train. But if you let me manage one game, I promise you I'll sell an article to a national magazine and give you and the Dodgers good publicity. I figured somebody would want the story of the first girl who ever managed a team, so he agreed.
That was a great pitch.
Thank you.
No wonder why you've been in Hollywood for so long. So tell me about, first of all, tell me about how your family and how everybody received this once you told them the news.
Most people did not know what to make of it at all. They were, it depended. My father was delighted because he used to take me to all the games. I was, I think he never wanted a son, but if he had a son, he would have done the things that I did with him. I loved going to the ball games with him. He was delighted, and my father always believed I or other women could do anything. When I was a little girl, he bought me 28 biographies of great women. That's the kind of dad he was. Some of my friends were perplexed. Tug was puzzled, because he knew me as his fan and support system. He didn't think I'd want to do something on my own. And most people were a little taken aback, including the Dodgers when I got there.
So that leads me to the game and arriving at the clubhouse. So what was that like?
It was fantastic. It was heart-stopping and frightening and terrific at the same time. A couple of the highlights were, I think Tommy just expected that I would sit next to him on the bench and say, go and yay. But I had other things in mind, and he eventually did just leave me on my own and watch from the stands. But one of the things that I did is I changed the Dodger batting order. I switched the cleanup and number 5 hitters, who were Garvey and Say. Say had been hitting cleanup, and Garvey had been hitting 5th.
Now, why did you do that? I didn't really get a chance to.
A lot of it had to do with base speed, because Say hitting behind Garvey could score him. The other way around, not so much. And there were other factors. They were both good power hitters. They were both good average hitters.
Did you know that going into the game, or was that something you just thought of?
No, that's something I had been observing in my time in spring training. I had seen it before, but it didn't really click for me until I'd spent a little time in spring training watching the intra-squads.
Great baseball mind.
Thank you. But I don't know that Ron Say immediately agreed with you. Later on, I met him at a party, and he said I did the right thing, and even the White Sox followed. But during the game, when Reggie Smith stepped out to bat third, Ron went into the on-deck circle. And I knew it was that moment where I was going to have to establish my authority. And I was very, very scared, but I called out to him and I was like, Ron, Ron. And he didn't want to really listen to me, but then he finally walked over with the 2 big Louisville sluggers. And I had posted the lineup card, but he didn't bother to look at it. And he said, what? And I said, you're batting 5th today. And he just looked at me right in the eye and he said, I bat cleanup. And I was shaking I didn't have cleats, by the way. I had to wear my 70s platform shoes. They didn't have any shoes for me to go with my
That must have been a sight.
So my ankles were wobbling. And I had to come up with an answer. So in that moment I said, not on my ball club. And there was a silence.
Pin drops.
Yes. And I was actually quite terrified. But I stood there. I tried not to shake. And thank God for Dusty Baker. He burst out laughing. Dusty, who later became very good at managing the mood on a team and became a manager himself. And he called out, he said, you better sit down, Penguin, or she's going to have you in Albuquerque by the end of the day. And he did, and Garvey got up and hit. And actually later in the season, they went to that lineup. And they pulled ahead of the Giants. They kept the lineup, won the National League pennant against my old friend Toby McGraw. But and the other big highlight of the game was in the 7th inning. The other team was at bat, and they had a runner on second, and there was a base hit, and the runner scored home, except I noticed that he never touched third base. So I appealed the play, but the umpire, who was this elderly man who did not think girls had a place in spring training, just said, oh, sit down, little girl, shoo me off like a fly. And I was not pleased with that, so I went out and I saw the tracks in the base pass. So I pointed to him and I said, look, right there, you can see he didn't touch. And the umpire was very disgusted with me, and he took his cleat and he started smoothing over the tracks, and he said, I see nothing, or I don't see anything. And I got so angry that I was like, that's not fair, I felt like he was punishing the team because of me, being a girl. And I started carrying on, and I had this sort of out-of-body experience where suddenly you're throwing your cap and nose to nose, and something I never ever imagined myself doing. And then suddenly, almost like in slow motion, I saw the thumb go out, and I heard him saying, you're out of here. And I really couldn't believe it. I was kind of stunned. But I got thrown out. He told me to go to the showers, which of course I was not allowed to do, but...
So not only is she the only female manager to ever manage a baseball game, but she gets thrown out at the same time and changes the lineup. So you definitely made quite the impact during that game.
It did energize the team, and we won it on a home run by Reggie Smith, who cracked his bat on the homer, and I still have that bat and treasure it.
That's amazing. So I have another question for you. I mean, females they've come a long way in sports now.
Oh, yeah.
How have you seen it change, and what do you think it means now to baseball? I mean, you went through this in 1978.
Yes.
And now we're in 2016 where there's a ref, there's an assistant coach in the NFL. What is your take on all this?
Oh, things are much, much better. When I was growing up, little girls were not playing Little League. I mean, there were no real professional women's sports teams. You didn't have any of the progress you're talking about. You didn't have a Kim Ng who might become the first female manager. But my take on it is that it's much better, but we're still not on a level playing field. And I think one of the things when I think about what happened in that year, I look at it, the Dodgers not getting their uniforms dirty, which changed. That year they fought their brains out. And there were players on that team like Dusty Baker, who became one of the first black managers. There was Glenn Burke, the first openly gay player in baseball on that squad, who did all the high five, who started the high five. But those players also were trying to break through social barriers. And I think what I learned in that year was that you have to keep on fighting. You've got to get your uniform dirty, because even with all the progress you make, there will always be an opponent out there trying to take those victories away. And when you look at our political scene right now, you can see there are people who would happily roll back a lot of the progress that's been made. So I think it's really important for women not to take the progress for granted, to be aware of it and to celebrate it, but to keep fighting.
That's amazing. So now there's a screenplay that you wrote on this story called Diamond Girl.
Yes, I just finished my first draft and I'm polishing it up before I get it around there.
Now, what made you decide to write that?
People always would ask me to tell them the story of my Dodger experience, and because I'm a TV and screenwriter, they'd say, oh, you should write a movie about that. But it was always awkward for me to think of writing a movie with a character based on myself at the center, until my friend Tug McGraw passed away. And I started reflecting on especially that season, which was a season where our friendship also evolved as I had grown up and met him on his own playing field. And when Tug passed away, I started looking back and thinking, well, what would I say about... I wrote the article for Cosmo from a 22-year-old perspective. What would I say about all that now? And I thought I would want to say, if you look at that squad that had Dusty Baker, who became one of the first black managers, Glenn Burke, inventor of the high five, who was the first openly gay player in Major League Baseball and had a sad ending to his career, and then myself, a woman trying to break through certain social barriers, and a team that needed to fight and get their uniforms dirty. I thought I wanted to look back and say we've made a lot of headway in all those areas, but there's always going to be an opponent who wants to overturn that victory, and you've got to fight hard and get your uniform dirty. And I thought that would be a good way to frame my experience and talk about how it changed my life and
honor Tug in the meanwhile.
And write my love letter to baseball. Yes.
That's amazing. Well, I, for one, want that movie to get made more than anything in the world, so hopefully we'll see that happen.
It's another thing we share.
Yes. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and all of us and sharing your story.
It was my pleasure, Alicia.
So check us out, notyouraverage.sportschick.com on Twitter, on Instagram, and the website, of course. And check us out next week. We'll have another great, exciting show. And our producer, Josh, will most likely be back on board. So get ready.
And I'd like
See
to
you
add
next week.
that I'm your biggest fan. I stepped on, I didn't mean to step on.